Starting the record.
Good evening. I'm Dennis Shelby with the Service Members and Veterans Initiative of the American Psychoanalytic Association. We want to welcome you to our fourth webinar series for this year. Tonight we have a couple of heavy hitters. First up is Dr. Harold Cudler. Dr. Cudler received his MD from Downstate Medical Center in Brooklyn, trained in psychiatry at Yale, and is adjunct associate professor at Duke. He has received teaching awards from the Duke Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, the American Psychiatric Association, and the American Psychoanalytic Association. From 2002 to 2010, Dr. Cudler coordinated mental health services for 3-state region of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and from 2000 to 2005, co-chaired VA's Special Committee on PTSD, which reports to Congress. He founded the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies and PTSD Practice Guidelines Task Force and has served on the ISTSS Board of Directors. He co-led development of the joint VA Department of Defense Guidelines for the Management of Post-Traumatic Stress and serves as an advisor to Sesame Street's Talk, Listen, Connect series for military families. From 2006 to 2014, he co-led the North Carolina governor's focus on returning military members and their families. In 2012, he was appointed to the North Carolina Institute of Medicine. From 2004 to 2014, Dr. Cudler was Associate Director of the VA's Mid-Atlantic Mental Illness Research, Education, and Clinical Center, which focuses on deployment mental health. From 2010 to 2013, Dr. Cudler was also medical lead for the VISN 6 Rural Health Initiative. And in July 2014, he joined the VA Central Office in Washington, D.C., where he serves as Chief Consultant for Mental Health Services. Dr. Cudler has a wonderful presentation tonight, and then Dr. Camp will respond to it. I've heard this before. I think it's a great overview of the current issues, and hope you enjoy it.
Well, thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Ritara, too. It's a pleasure to be able to present this evening and really looking forward to doing that, but especially to the conversation afterward. So tonight's presentation is called Repeating the Past in Pathology and Theory, Practical Suggestions for the Field of Traumatic Stress. And of course, the very next slide is the standard disclosure. What follows are my personal views rather than those of the Department of Veterans Affairs. But the disclosure slide leaves me room to put in this little quote from William Faulkner, who was so obsessed about the past and the present. And this statement, "the past is never dead, it's not even past," really provides a theme for this discussion of the status of traumatic stress research and clinical work, which can only be fully understood and projected into the future if we pay attention to our own past. Now, a little, you know, hopefully you won't get tired of history and pictures, but this is an observation from Sir Francis Bacon, one of the fathers of empiricism, and really a man who helped shape modern science back in the early 17th century. And he made this statement: "Medicine is a science which hath been more professed and labored, and yet more labored than advanced. The labor having been, in my judgment, rather encircled than in progression, for I find much iteration, but small addition." And for those who, you know, aren't into 1605 writings, basically what he's saying is that medicine advances in circles rather than in straight lines. And frankly, he also points out that people talk more about what they've accomplished than they really accomplish. And that there's very little that's new in medicine at any given time for all that talk. The fact is that it's probably still a valid observation. There have been immense and rapid changes in all of medicine, and I've had a chance to observe that over the last 30-something years since I graduated medical school. But I think that Bacon's observation is still something we need to pay attention to as researchers and practitioners. And the fact is, if medicine advances in cycles or circles, maybe we can be excused because medicine, like all sciences, attempts to describe nature. And since medicine is an applied science, it seeks to use that knowledge to promote health. Yet as this figure, which was borrowed from Phil Gold and colleagues, Phil Gold did an awful lot of the physiological research in the early days of depression and PTSD. As this diagram kind of makes clear, whether you're talking about the interactions of the hypothalamic pituitary axis and stress, or almost any other physiological system, the foci of medical studies are not in fact linear, but rather they're cyclical. Things go in circles, things create loops and they close loops. Therefore, I hope medicine, and in this case the field of traumatic stress, can be forgiven if its advance is somewhat circular, somewhat cyclic. If you collect enough circles over time, you'll realize that we're moving forward in a cyclic manner, and that our status at any given time is really dynamic, not static. And this perhaps is simply a phenomenon of, a reflection rather, a phenomena we're trying to study in medicine, and particularly in the field of traumatic stress. Another philosopher of science that we could pay attention to is George Santayana, who's often misquoted on this quote, but said back in 1905, 300 years after Bacon, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." So, like our patients and clinicians and researchers in the field of traumatic stress, it's important that we remember our past in order to illuminate our present, understand its dynamics, and move beyond constant repetition and iteration to progress. But there are problems in trying to keep your eye on the past, the present, and the future. History itself is dynamic. It can't be reduced to straight lines, even if we'd like to tell a story from beginning to end. The story is always changing. It's always dynamic. And the dynamics of science are often very powerful, whether it's the dynamics of the patient, the family, and the community in which the patient lives, if it's the dynamics going on between patient and clinician, if it's the dynamics between mental health professionals, like clinicians versus researchers. In the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, we've had a real schism between clinicians and researchers. I'm just going to turn that off. If a study with within different systems like steroids versus structures, a lot of my colleagues get excited about the amygdala versus the hippocampus versus the hypothalamic pituitary axis. And these are really interesting areas, and each of them is an interesting perch, an interesting perspective from which to study traumatic stress. But once you begin to get too focused on any one of them, you very quickly lose sight of the others. And what I've seen over the course of many years in the field of traumatic stress is that once somebody picks, this is my perspective, this is the way I approach traumatic stress, it's very hard for them to see any other way of looking at the issue. And often people end up talking past each other. Then you have files for different disciplines, perspectives in schools, and this is very clear in the study of psychotherapy for PTSD, cognitive behavioral. Are you interested instead in prolonged exposure and a more classic behavioral paradigm? Or perhaps EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or maybe body therapies, or of course psychoanalytic psychotherapies. And then there's the problem of just plain people being people, which is often the most complex phenomenon of all. It's very hard sometimes to tell our story from beginning to end and have it make sense when it comes out. But for better or for worse, you can't advance human understanding without involving human beings. And approaching the complexity of human biology and human experience simultaneously. As we can see, even Freud really wanted to spend his career talking about a sort of neurological approach to psychology, but eventually realized he couldn't do both at one time. We're still trying to solve that problem. And tonight we'll talk a little bit about how one does it 100 years after Freud. But for better or for worse, one way or the other, we're stuck with dynamics, biological and personal. That at least should set the ground for a very interesting conversation. So an apology, especially for people who are not speaking English as a first language. And I know we get people from all over the world. It's one of the great things about this seminar. I hope I'm not speaking too fast. I will stop if anyone puts a question. I can't see the questions, but if someone has one, I'll be glad to stop. But let me make this point. Because the task of remembering history and of making progress in medicine is complexly layered and highly dynamic, like physiology, like the structure and function of the brain, like our thoughts, our feelings, like the communities we live in, this presentation is going to range back and forth. I've already demonstrated that. Back and forth across time, people, systems, and ideas in order to best describe and contextualize the status of our field and hopefully articulate some pathways forward. So my own introduction to the field of traumatic stress began in 1980 when I became a resident, it was my very first psychiatry rotation at the West Haven Veterans Affairs Medical Center. And for those who aren't used to the Department of Veterans Affairs in the United States, this is a hospital system created especially to deal with the problems of veterans, whether it's deployment to a combat area or other aspects of serving in the military. The VA hospital is there to serve them, and it fills a gap that otherwise exists in community practice of medicine, a gap which really is a lack of military cultural competence and of experience in talking about or working with the kind of traumatic issues that service members often spend their whole lives trying to sort out. One of my very first psychotherapy supervisors was a fellow named Art Blank, and maybe you can see my cursor circling Art here. And my first chief of service, the first chief of psychiatry where I worked, was this fellow, Paul Herrera. And as these fellows tried to teach me how to be a psychiatrist, Art Blank had a kind of shadow curriculum. We didn't read these books in the seminar Art taught, but we talked about him in supervision with him. We talked not about PTSD because it wasn't in the books then. We talked about Vietnam stress syndrome. And maybe some of you have read Charles Figley's books, including a book called Vietnam Stress Syndrome, which had come out around that time. These were a shadow curriculum because not in medical school and to that moment not in American psychiatry did we really have a construct for talking about psychological trauma. And Art posed the radical idea that just maybe the mental health problems that brought all these veterans to our wards had something to do with the fact that they were veterans who had experienced psychological trauma. And quite frankly, most of our teachers at the VA didn't look at it that way. They said this is just a hospital with a different benefit system. Not this is a hospital that is dealing with a different kind of problem and requires a special perspective. The DSM-3 was published a few months after I started at West Haven, and that was the beginning of thinking about PTSD, something which still, the book came out, we didn't think about it a great deal at that time. It was only years later that PTSD really began to be talked about, and people began to wonder what it is and what to do about it. I want to point out that Paul Herrera, the chief of psychiatry, went on to Washington, and I've been lucky enough now to do the job that he used to do. Paul Herrera was a great one for pointing out that what a psychiatrist really needed to know was not the names of a lot of disorders, but he needed to understand that people are people, and that the most important thing that we could study were how people, including us, we ourselves, acted in a given situation, especially a stressful situation. And as you know, training in psychiatry or in any psychological field is very stressful. We had lots of things to study. So the DSM-3, which came out in 1980, established a diagnosis of PTSD while asserting that it had an atheoretical descriptive approach. It was a compromise in American psychiatry between the psychoanalytic people who kind of were running American psychiatry for a few generations and a new generation of more biological psychiatrists who wanted DSM-3 so they could validate certain diagnoses and say with certainty that if you treated a patient in New York or in Los Angeles, if you use the DSM-3, you could be pretty sure that if you called them one thing in New York, you could call them the same thing in Los Angeles. Quite frankly, DSM-2, you were left to use your own devices as to whether this person really had schizophrenia or were they bipolar. You had to use your own training and your own imagination, but there were no anchor points. DSM-3 provided them, which was a tremendous breakthrough and made a lot of the advancement in psychiatry since 1980 possible. DSM-3, therefore, was really part of an effort to medicalize mental health, to make it reproducible, and if atheoretical, to kind of lay out what the categories were that we were paying attention to and make sense of them, and then begin to come up with treatments that would best meet the needs of people with each category of mental disorder. It's interesting that very recently, the National Institutes of Mental Health, which in the United States really are responsible not only for framing mental health policy, but also for funding a lot of mental health research, recently came out with a further reduction of mental disorders into even more fundamental and primarily biological components. And this is a quote from a blog from the head of the NIMH that came out about a year and a half ago. He said that NIMH wants to sort of think about psychiatry in terms of targets, which are hypothesized mechanisms of action, and their ability to modify disease, behavior, or functional outcomes. The underlying assumption being that modification of these targets would result in improvement in a clinical state. So the NIMH wants us to get past even diagnoses to start thinking about mechanisms of actions. And for the most part, they've been interested in genes, in molecules, in brain structures, in physiology, not so much in terms of thought or behavior. Something interesting, though, just at the same time that American psychiatry, and in fact the VA medical centers where I went on to have my career, were becoming more medicalized, where mental health was becoming less about what was going on in the minds of the patients and more about what was going on in their brains. The VA spun off an entirely different set of centers. There are now 300 of these across the United States, as well as 80 mobile versions of these. And these are called the vet centers. And the fact is that concurrent with the release of DSM-3 and the inclusion of PTSD, there was a rising awareness of post-deployment mental health issues among Vietnam veterans that needed to be addressed in very human terms. The vet centers were, by definition, not medical. They were readjustment counseling centers. And the idea was people with PTSD often didn't want to go to the hospital. They didn't want to talk to a psychiatrist, but they would talk to a counselor. They would talk about their lives, their jobs, their families, so long as nobody put a diagnosis on them. And the vet center was created as a place where they could do that, often in the context of coming for social activities, to talk in groups, to learn about opportunities for vocational training or new jobs, or just to hang out with other veterans and to have family events with other veterans' families. So at the very same time that the VA medical centers were embracing the zeitgeist of medicalizing mental health, the vet center program was designed to engage veterans on their own terms, very human terms. RCS, another term for the vet center's readjustment counseling service, provided a critically important alternative to VAs, which approached deployment mental health in personal, family, community, and cultural terms. And the funny thing is, to this day, clinicians, administrators, and most important, veterans and their families often segregate either into a VA for medical treatment or into a vet center for counseling. And very few people, certainly not enough people, go back and forth, and rarely do the staff of the vet centers and the staff of the VA medical centers talk to each other, even though they're often dealing with exactly the same veterans. And it leads to the interesting question of why is there this divide when they're all part of the VA program? Why are they so segregated? And I have a hypothesis about that the vet centers provide a critically important pathway for veterans of Vietnam, and this has since been expanded to veterans of all military operations before and since Vietnam. But might the emphasis on distinguishing vet centers from VA medical centers that was so critical at the beginning of the Vet Center program reflect an underlying tension that really is, and I apologize for those who don't speak English, maybe a few who do, a conceptual bifurcation, a splitting between medicalizing versus personalizing psychological trauma that really is something that has been going on at least since DSM-3. That the vet centers followed the very personal part of mental health, and the VA Medical Center said, this is a diagnosis, this is a disorder, this is a biological problem, and we're going to approach it at the biological level. I think that that's actually a fairly valid hypothesis. And going to my colleagues in VA, both in vet centers and in medical centers, they agree. These groups are so different in the way they think and talk about and approach and try to treat psychological trauma that it's very difficult to imagine working with the same patient across both VA medical centers and vet centers. Now, it's interesting because oddly enough, the establishment of PTSD in the DSM and the development of the vet center model both derive from the work of two psychoanalysts, Chaim Shaitan and Robert J. Lifton. These two psychoanalysts, who were very active in American psychoanalysis in the 70s, were invited by a group of veterans called Vietnam Veterans Against the War to observe what were called then RAP groups where people sat around and talked. And the Vietnam Veterans Against the War were holding these groups and had been for some time. But they realized that there might be value in getting mental health professionals to observe what was going on in order to help them make the RAP groups even more effective and more helpful. Veterans liked getting together and talking, but they weren't really sure if they were talking about the right things. So they asked psychiatrists, psychoanalysts. When Shaitan and Lifton, and I've had the opportunity to work with both of them, they've both been teachers of mine, and they talked about how when they got in these groups and listened to these veterans, they realized these veterans really did have a new psychiatric disorder, one that they had never been taught about. And so they went to the American Psychiatric Association and said, you got to get this into the DSM. But they also worked to bring attention of the value of talking to the groups as a means of readjustment. They really pushed both sides. I don't think they could have imagined in the 1970s how far apart those two sides of the coin would end up by the late 1980s. Another thread in this story is the work of psychoanalyst and psychiatrist, also Holocaust survivor, Henry Crystal. I don't know how many of you have read Henry Crystal's work. Even though Crystal survived the Holocaust as a young teenager, I think he was 14 when he was imprisoned in Sachsenhausen concentration camp, which is a short train ride outside of Berlin. He was 17 when he got out and came to the United States. He didn't intend to have a career working on these issues. But later in his career, he was actually invited by the German government to talk to Jewish survivors living in the United States. The reason being these Jewish survivors of the Holocaust who had survived the concentration camps refused to accept any kind of reparations. They didn't want money from the German government, even though the German government would have felt better if they could give that money. And so the German government actually hired Crystal to go talk to him. And in talking with other concentration camp survivors, Crystal recognized certain patterns among them. And this resulted in his 1968 book, Massive Psychic Trauma, which are actually the proceedings of a conference he pulled together. Just reading the table of contents of this conference, who was invited and what they talked about. People spoke about war, they spoke about refugees, they spoke about Holocaust survivors, soldiers, civilians. It's an amazing book. 20 years later, he published a book which I recommend to you highly. It's hard to read, it's a little thick, but it's brilliant and well worth reading. Integration and Self-Healing. And in this book, Crystal suggested that psychological trauma overwhelms the capacity of the brain and the mind. He didn't really separate those. It overwhelms the capacity, if you will, of the brain-mind system's ability to employ affects as useful signals. In other words, he created an extension of Freud's theory of signal anxiety, which I'll come back to you with a refresher in just a moment. And his position was that once anxiety could no longer flexibly mobilize defense, then the psyche would become incapable of managing any new experience, or for that matter, processing old ones. You could no more manage a difficult situation we're facing today than you could manage thinking about your memories from your past. You're left without words for feelings, which Crystal called alexithymia, a term he developed for this. And he said that being severely traumatized basically burnt out your ability to feel or manage your own feelings. Now, coming back to this idea of signal anxiety, I apologize for the cartoon. I don't really take this lightly, but nonetheless, this cartoon appeals to me because it illustrates the point I think Crystal was trying to make. Freud had this idea about signal anxiety, that in the healthy psyche, when there's danger outside, the ego will signal the psyche, and the psyche will mobilize defense. So in our cartoon, the wolf knocks on the door, and the pigs, in this case, the three little pigs inside, look out the door. They see there's danger. They bar the door. They mobilize defense, and the danger is averted. And that's the way the system's supposed to work. But in trauma, this system does not work well, because faced with traumatic anxiety, you're faced with a situation when that danger is so overwhelming that it breaks through the door. The interface between the external world and the world of the psyche is broken down. This is what Freud was talking about in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and where he hypothesizes that the ego has a kind of stimulus barrier, or let's say the entire psyche has a stimulus barrier, which on a regular basis, under good conditions, protects us from the shocks of everyday life. But if some overwhelming danger, some traumatic event breaches the stimulus barrier, it not only causes pain abruptly, but it changes the nature of the ego. It leads to changes that are internal, and the system is forever going to respond differently. So if the wolf broke down the door, forget about mobilizing defense, things are going to go very badly for the pigs inside. And in fact, there will no longer be a door to knock on the next time some other danger comes along. You are really left without any interface. That includes the ability to use your emotions as an interface between your life experience and your internal psychic experience. This really is a disorganization of the entire foundation, structure, and function of the ego. Now, interestingly enough, thinking historically and in cycles, Henry Crystal has a son, John Crystal, who is the chairman of psychiatry at Yale. I've known John for more than 20 years. John Crystal is as interested in signaling systems as his father was, but he pursues them at the level of neurobiology. And in particular, John has been talking about the glutamate system for as long as I've known him, long before I ever thought about the glutamate system, and we certainly weren't taught it in medical school or in residency. Glutamate, a neuromessenger, message-carrying molecule, is the most important and most prevalent of the excitatory neurotransmitters that we know of in the brain. And John has been thinking about PTSD in terms of disruption in the brain's capacity to appropriately manage signals because of dysfunctions in the glutamate system. He really believes this neuroexcitatory system is probably one of the levels that we should be studying in PTSD, not the only one, but one of them. And that has led him to study ketamine, which is an N-methyl D-aspartate, or NMDA, glutamate receptor antagonist, as a potential treatment for PTSD. And just yesterday, working in VA central office, I took part in a meeting, a fairly high-level meeting, about whether VA would like to endorse ketamine treatment for PTSD. Many of you may have heard that ketamine is now being used as a very rapid way to reverse at least some severe cases of depression, and that it may be very helpful in PTSD treatment as well. This remains to be seen, but there are some good indications, and clinicians want to have the freedom within their own clinical, to have the clinical choice to use ketamine as a treatment when all else fails. Frankly, I kind of empathize with them on that. We'll see what's decided at the institutional level. The bottom line being, Henry and John Crystal both agree that signaling is essential in PTSD. And John goes a little further, because one of ketamine's effects is an increase in neuroplasticity, in the structure and resilience and growth of neuronal systems in the brain. So here's a quote from John. Excuse me. Where the brain is concerned, sometimes in order to get better, it's necessary to restore the capacity of the neural system to remodel itself. Sometimes it's a deficit in that capacity, a deficit in neuroplasticity, the ability for the brain to restore itself, that is part of what we think of as the illness. So in almost psychoanalytic terms, the illness is a process. It's not simply something broken somewhere, a broken bit of anatomy, a broken molecule, a bad gene. It's actually a much more complex process in which the lack of the ability to self-repair is part of the presentation of the illness. In the case of stress disorders, John suggests that we've learned that traumatic stress can cause the retraction of certain knob-like input centers called dendritic spines, which are places where the signaling structures come into nerve cells. And this is particularly true in the glutamate neurons of the brain. So the glutamate neurons of the brain, under stress, retract and become less sensitive. They have less surface area. They're not tuned in. They're not able to receive or process signals as effectively as they should. Alexithymia in his father's language. John points out that there's evidence of spine retraction of the symptoms seen in stress and anxiety disorders, which include impaired memory function and, even more important, impaired capacity to learn to respond to stressors in new and therapeutic ways. You're stuck responding in the old way over and over. So if your capacity for neuroplasticity is impaired, the capacity of these networks to learn and adapt and become resilient once again is overcome. This is his way of thinking about what trauma is at a biological level. But it's very much what his dad said about it at a psychological level. If we conceive of PTSD as a pathological alteration of brain circuitry, which we're certainly allowed to do, some of which is already suggested by functional neuroimaging, then perhaps increasing neuroplasticity could facilitate the creation, or maybe better, the recreation, of adaptive neural pathways, which could help resolve the problem of traumatic stress. In other words, in terms of our cartoon, build a new door, maybe even install a very efficient doorbell, and people could restore their signal processing capacity and be well again. It's interesting to note that transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is also being tested in PTSD, I think the jury's still out, but there are some signs it may be helpful as it is in depression. Magnetic stimulation also alters the activity of similar brain circuits and may be increasing neuroplasticity as well, in a way that's complementary to ketamine's effects, all of which brings to mind Eric Kandel's statement in his seminal article, Psychotherapy and the Single Synapse, where he says, I'd argue that it's only insofar as our words produce changes in each other's brains that psychotherapeutic interventions produce changes in the minds of patients. So perhaps a neurochemical intervention like ketamine, a transcranial magnetic intervention like TMS, and a psychotherapeutic intervention like talk therapy all act on the same essential pathology. They all act on a loss of signal processing secondary to psychological trauma that results in a residual pathological response. And maybe restitution requires the development of new neural networks, connections, facilitations, with consequent effects on thoughts, feelings, interpersonal relations. And I really want to emphasize that if you want to get at the human brain, one of the best ways to get there doesn't require fancy equipment. It's talking and listening. Because as Kandel says, that too can actually change the structure of neuronal systems. These are all ways in, and it's really a matter of figuring out the best way in for this individual at this point. I'll mention, and I'm cognizant of time too, I bet Dennis and Mike are, that epigenetic changes have recently been pointed out in psychological trauma, actual changes in the way genes are methylated. In other words, whether genes are flexible or not flexible. Can they be opened and transcribed efficiently, or are they blocked by a methyl group? And apparently trauma blocks gene transcription. Might these be a sort of evolutionary fast track that lets the brain adapt in a dangerous world? Frankly, in a dangerous world, do you want to feel pain? Do you want to be constantly buffeted, or is it better not to, well, on the one hand, to be very, very safe, but also not to do too much processing? I know combat veterans often point out that when you're in combat, there really isn't time to think and feel. You have to act. Maybe a lot of the mechanisms that become stuck in a way that ultimately is pathological are really part of an effort to adapt, that once you overcompensate the trauma, get stuck in place, and now you have pathology. Epigenetic changes may be just another level of that kind of adaptation that unfortunately becomes part of your pathology given time. So in a strange way, and trying to get back to my circular theme, this brings us all the way back to Freud's 1895 unpublished work during his lifetime, which he called Psychology for Neurologists, although his editor, James Strachey, called it the Project for Scientific Psychology. And I won't take up a lot of your time explaining this. If you've never read the project, it's well worth it. Freud, in this diagram, is trying to explain how psychological trauma and repression work in neural and purely neurological terms. And what he's saying is that normally, when some overwhelming stimulus, in that case, this is QN in Freud's handwriting, a quantum of overwhelming stimulus enters the receptive system of the nervous system. This is the perceptual system, and it goes into from perception into awareness, processing, and on its way to memory. If this is a traumatic quantum of experience, all it can do is produce incredible pain, which Freud says would frankly be pointless. If the mind didn't evolve some way to cope with instances of overwhelming stimulation, it wouldn't be able to adapt and manage in the world. So Freud says the ego is developed both as a mind and a brain function. And this diagram shows you that, yes, you could go right to unpleasure and be overwhelmed, or the same stimulus could follow a different track and go into the ego. And I won't spend a lot of time with the alpha, beta, and delta of this, but if you will, what Freud is showing here is that the brain and the mind have adapted a way to drain off this overwhelming quantum of energy and store it. This is, in fact, a neurological model of repression, so that that overwhelming memory and the feelings associated with it get put in deep storage. Now, you pay a price for this. That quantum is stuck inside of you, and it can produce neuroses. But on the other hand, you are not overwhelmed and going down the path to pure unpleasure, traumatic anxiety, as he went on to call it. And to Freud, this is what hysterical people were doing. In some ways, strangely enough, a lot of the modern neurobiological theories are actually coming to repeat these same themes. Neurological and even genetic systems meant to hold and store trauma, to insulate the mind and brain from trauma in order not to feel it, but only at a price. That price might be PTSD. So, turning a corner on this, how do we go from all these people over all this time trying to take the same phenomenon, describe it in different terms, and being like the blind man and the elephant? How do we look at the history of our field, the many concepts, the many approaches, and pull them together? This is what Leon Eisenberg called, how do we prevent going from a brainless psychiatry to a mindless one, and then back again? The fact is, if you look across modern theories and treatments of PTSD, the leading evidence-based psychotherapies like prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, or cognitive behavioral therapy in general, or EMDR, eye movement desensitization therapy, all agree in a very basic way that the resolution of disorders of traumatic stress depend on facilitating the survivor's ability to forge vital connections between memories, thoughts, and affects. They just each go about it differently. They all say that there's a problem in processing that has to be overcome. And this is a longer slide. I won't read it all to you, but PE tries to stimulate emotional processing by habituating the mind and brain to noxious affects, feeling like if we can get that overwhelming noxious feeling associated with new experiences out of the way, normal processing and resolution can take place. Cognitive processing says, well, you've got these cognitive stuck points, and if I can help you resolve the stuck points, you can start processing your experience, including your traumatic experience, and again, normalcy will ensue. EMDR has a more biological approach, but it says if I can make your eyes move while you're thinking about a traumatic experience, this is going to stimulate a brain process very similar to the brain process in REM sleep, and you are going to be able to start effectively processing memory, mood, and thoughts. They're all really saying you've just got to get processing again. And all agree with Santayana and with Freud that by becoming able to remember the past, you can stop repeating it. You become free from repetition. It's really one metaphor for all of these. And as psychoanalysts, what can we bring to this? Well, VA's clinical practice guidelines reflect the landmark success of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs at disseminating evidence-based therapies. We've trained over 10,000 clinicians to deliver these therapies. And we've actually said, if we have evidence-based therapies, that's the first ones we're getting out in the field. Cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, and now we're pushing EMDR. It's great that we can do this, and I agree. These are evidence-based, there's empirical science, let's look at them. And I would never argue against science. I'm a great fan of science. But on the other hand, a weakness has been exposed over the last 10 years of us churning out these evidence-based therapies. Most of them are manualized therapies, and the training and supervision in cognitive therapy and in prolonged exposure have, for the most part, centered on mastering specific skills and maintaining adherence to the manuals, with much less emphasis on the nature of therapeutic relationships or on the disciplined assessment and management of the therapeutic relationship as a core component of psychotherapy. We're all about the doing things according to the manual. We're not paying attention to what's going on in the room between the patient and the therapist. This slide is simply a summary of different aspects of what goes on in the room in the therapeutic relationship. The working alliance, which is the enduring commitment between patient and therapist to work toward a common goal. Transference and countertransference. And the real relationship being that reality-oriented aspect of the interaction between therapist and patient who work as equals to solve the patient's problem. The fact is, as therapy proceeds, if it goes well, the therapeutic relationship moves from transference and countertransference more and more to be characterized by the real relationship. Frankly, once you have a real relationship between a patient and therapist, it's probably as good a sign as any that it's time for the therapy to be over. The fact is that even the American Psychological Association, which has done so much to promote cognitive therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, EMDR, has also developed a task force on the importance of paying attention to the therapeutic relationship, one of the core elements of psychoanalytic practice and theory. They point out that the therapy relationship makes substantial and consistent contributions to psychotherapy outcome independent of the type of treatment, that the therapy relationship accounts for why clients improve or fail to improve at least as much as the form of treatment you choose to apply, that the practice and treatment guidelines that we're writing, and the American Psychological has just composed their own first guideline for PTSD, that these guidelines should explicitly address therapist behaviors and the qualities to promote a facilitative therapy relationship. And that efforts to promulgate best practices or evidence-based practices without including the therapeutic relationship are seriously incomplete and potentially misleading. These are direct quotes from the American Psychological Association. What they're really saying is something that's been said in medicine for, over and over the centuries, that science, things we can see with a microscope, empirical testing, well-controlled experiments are important. They're essential. We can't do without them. But if you ever tried to practice medicine without paying attention to what's happening between the doctor and the patient, you're probably going to miss a great deal of what actually is helpful. You need to be able to pay attention to both levels simultaneously to see synergy in these things. For the last 20 years, you either are a manual person or you're, if you will, a soft-nosed, touchy-feely person who's paying attention to the patient or to yourself. The fact is we have to recover these essential elements and forge a new kind of mental health approach that really works from the best aspects of both. And I would argue that if we did that, it would enhance the engagement of the veteran treatment because they felt listened to and respected as a person, which people often don't when they're simply given taking part in a manualized therapy. That new opportunities would come up to understand key issues because of the patient's transference and listening to their perspective, and also because the therapist would pay attention to their own perspective and their own countertransference. This would lead to better clinical outcomes, and I'd further argue it would decrease therapist burnout. And therapist burnout has been a cause of increasing concern in both military medicine and in VA medicine, as it has been in medicine in general. I would argue that one of the reasons there's therapist burnout is that therapists don't get to use their own human capacities. They're told, ignore that stuff and just do what's in the manual. And I think you're losing valuable clues to what's going on in the room, and you're burning yourself out in the process. So, if we're to understand and advance the state of our union in the field of traumatic stress research and practice, we need new ways to look at our own history and our own basic concepts and to look at what's growing out of them in modern research, modern clinical practice. Remembering that neither science nor medicine are competitive sports, we have to stop saying, I think this way, you think that way, let's agree not to talk to each other. There has to be a sharp focus and control of variables, as is always required in experimental science. But when we apply these findings to the care of human beings, the practice of medicine, or the development of systems of care, or policies and funding mechanisms which define and support our systems of care, we really have to always think in more complex terms that are appropriate to work at the human level, which is, after all, what science and medicine are really meant to do. As Alexander Pope said, the proper study of mankind is man. And to finish with one last quote, Sir William Osler, arguably the father of American medicine, said, "He who studies medicine without books sails on an uncharted sea, but he who studies medicine without patients does not go to sea at all." I think it's important we as psychotherapists bring our patients back into the equation so that we can go as far as possible in helping them, and for that matter, developing our own skills and our own professional abilities. So let me stop there and thank you for your attention. And Mike, I hope I've left you enough time. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Harold. We're going to get, see, Mike looks like he needs to unmute there. And while he's doing that and getting set up, I'm going to introduce him. So we have, actually, I forgot to mention that Dr. Kudler is chair of the Service Members and Veterans Initiative at APSA, and his co-chair is Mike Camp. His name, he's not Harold Kudler, he is Mike Camp. So let me give you some Mike's bio. Dr. Norman Mike Camp earned his medical degree from the University of Tennessee and received a psychiatric training at Walter Reed General Hospital in Washington, D.C. On his graduation in the summer of 1970, he deployed in Vietnam, where he served as a psychiatrist and commanding officer of the 98th Neuropsychiatric Medical Specialty Detachment, one of 2 definitive psychiatric treatment centers in the theater. After his return, he completed child and adolescent psychiatry fellowship training at the Letterman Army Hospital, University of California, San Francisco, and psychoanalytic training with the Baltimore, D.C. Institute for Psychoanalysis. Dr. Camp also held a variety of clinical, academic, and administrative positions in the U.S. Army Medical Corps and retired in 1988 at the rank of colonel. He currently teaches at Virginia Commonwealth University Medical Center in Richmond, Virginia, where he holds the rank of clinical professor of psychiatry. Dr. Camp is best known for his recent released book, U.S. Army Psychiatry in the Vietnam War, New Challenges in Extended Counterinsurgency Warfare, which was published by the Office of the Army Surgeon General and is available for free download from the Borden Institute website. And his book is quite an eye-opener on how not to run a war. Please don't lose your records. They're valuable information. We need them for the next time we play war. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike Camp. Are you ready with your screen share there, Mike? I think you just want to run your cursor up to slideshow there.
You can do that or use the quick key F5.
Oh, almost had it. Over there, you've got an older version there, right? Hit the slideshow up on the top. See where my cursor's going? Help window slideshow. Go to the right, help window, and then slideshow. Click slideshow.
It's on the top.
Help window slideshow. Yep, 1 back, 2 back. There you go. You slow. All right. It's yours.
You got to unmute your mic too, I think.
Yes. Can't hear him. Let's see. I'll unmute him so he can. Mike, can you hear us?
He's unmuted.
Yeah, he's unmuted.
But maybe not on his computer.
Yeah,
No, he had this, I saw the icon.
just unmuted it.
Okay, now unmute. Did you turn the volume down on your computer by mistake? you want me to read it for you?
Well, maybe we should go to open discussion while Mike works on that. I'm sure it's a matter of finding. There may be another mute button on his computer over and above the mute button for this program that is in the wrong position.
Well, we can do that. If you have, while we get Dr. Camp set up here, do you have any questions for Dr. Cudler? If you do, go ahead and use the chat feature. It's at the bottom of your screen. Run your cursor down there. You'll see a Q&A file. Or you can also use the chat feature. So we got some time here. Any questions for Dr. Cudler? Norman, you could, if you run your slideshow, I could read the slides. How's that? Doesn't look like we have any questions coming in.
It'd be interesting just to have the participants identify themselves if they wouldn't mind. Interesting to know who's out there. Ah.
So I'm trying to get something going.
Gotcha.
You know, Harold, one of the things, you know me, I'm a theory history nerd kind of guy. I was kind of baffled that with the number of books on war trauma that had been written prior to Vietnam, you kind of, your account made it sound like people felt they were discovering something for the first time.
I think when you read, whether you're reading Civil War, American Civil War work, or if you're reading the British or the Americans in World War I, and and I've read in translation a little bit about what Germans and Russians and French said. People always feel they're just discovering something new.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be an occupational hazard. And then what happens is they seem to go out of their way to forget it before the next war.
Right. That was the part. Talk about repetition compulsion. This tendency to forget what had been contributed in the prior war. It goes on a shelf somewhere or falls off of the syllabi, and so no one's taught it by the time the next war rolls around.
Well, once in a while, someone like Abram Gardner, who worked with veterans after World War I, will write like his famous monograph on traumatic neuroses, and he opens it up by saying that I didn't think anybody would ever need to know what I learned working with World War I veterans, but I guess here, I think he was writing in 1938 or so, I guess we're going to need this. So let me tell you what happened then. And I found a few books that start that way. On the other hand, Grinker and Spiegel, two US Army Air Force psychiatrists, and Grinker was the more senior and was a very accomplished psychiatrist. They wrote during the North African campaign at the beginning of American involvement in World War II that no one had prepared them for what they were seeing working as Air Force psychiatrists, the kind of breakdown, which was often then called pilot fatigue. And so they also say in their book, I guess when we invade Europe later, when we eventually move from North Africa to Europe, there are going to be a lot more cases like this. And it would be really valuable for us to write this down so you'll know what we learned trying to figure this out for ourselves. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that people have difficulty translating their point of view into other people's point of view. And they get caught up very much in their own perspective, and then they're not always good at sharing it or communicating to other people. But I see that Natalia is writing. Yeah, well, welcome, Natalia. And you're starting your master's in mental health counseling? Yeah, on PTSD. Yes, well, I hope it wasn't too confusing. I realized we went in circles, and that often is very confusing. I'll tell you another observation. In the American Civil War, the two men who did the most in medicine to describe the mental health problems of the soldiers who served in the U.S. Civil War, one was a cardiologist named DaCosta, and another was a neurologist named Silas Weir Mitchell. The two men actually worked at the same Union Army hospital in Philadelphia and knew each other. But when one wrote about what he observed, he wrote it in terms of cardiology, which is where the term soldier's heart comes from. And the other one wrote in terms of neurasthenia, weakness of the nerves as a neurological disorder. And the two of them were describing the same patients and the same veterans of the same battles. But their perspective, one is a cardiologist, one is a neurologist, really made it difficult for anybody to read both their works and see the same people or the same problems. And I do worry, as much as I like working in a multidisciplinary team with psychologists, with social workers, with biological psychiatrists, and if you will, psychological psychiatrists, I really do worry that we become so invested in the way we look at things and the way our teachers taught us that we have trouble listening to other people or conceptualizing. And thank you, Natalia, I appreciate that. It wasn't easy to keep up, though. I had trouble keeping up with myself, so I appreciate you keeping up. And we also had, yes, an Enklo from Albania. Welcome. It's really nice to have someone join us all the way from Albania. I wonder if right now, for instance, in Albania, people are talking about, because Albania has seen its share of trauma over the last few decades, if people are conceptualizing the problems that evolved there and their treatment in one pretty in one dominant theory, or if in fact there's much confusion. Again, the story of the blind man and the elephant. the three blind men and the elephant, I always think of. Is there one sort of main theory that's being applied, or are there many theories being applied? Yes, talk therapy, very recent, yes. Here's Mike back. Mike, are you?
Hello.
Hey!
I'm sorry. All right. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No. Welcome back. Glad to have you. Mike, did you want to say a few words? I don't know. Dennis is keeping an eye on the time, but did you want to say a little bit?
Mike's got a PowerPoint there.
His sound went back out.
Sure did. It's a conspiracy, Mike.
Mike, you can go ahead and email me your PowerPoints. I can throw them up. If you want to do that. Because I have seen Mike's response, and I thought he made some great points and about the tensions and.
Can we post these to a website so that people can
Yes.
have copies of? And if you look at my slides in the view version of PowerPoint, there's a lot of extra stuff which at least will help you fall asleep at night. But it might, especially on the Freud. I don't know how many people have ever read Project for Scientific Psychology, but here's a very young Sigmund Freud staying up all night writing this stuff down, thinking he's got the answer to understanding psychological trauma biologically and psychologically at the same time. And then one day he wakes up and says, why did I think I could do this? And he rips the whole thing up. We only have a copy of the manuscript that he sent to his friend Wilhelm Fliess. And years later, when Fliess died, Freud found out from Fliess's widow that he still had a copy of this. Freud tried to buy it with the intention of ripping that one up too. But we're lucky we get to see Freud dealing with the same problem that I was trying to talk about today. Trying to come to a way that is biological and psychological at the same time. But, you know, Engel points out community. When you're in the middle of a combat area, when you're, you know, the war isn't far away when it's at home. Sometimes community work is exactly the right level of conceptualization and of treatment when you're dealing with disaster. It doesn't help to have what one person called the trauma tourists parachute in to save you with the brilliance of their medicine or their psychoanalytic ideas or even EMDR. And all that's been done and more. It really helps to try to reinforce the strength of the community at a community level, to work through the strengths of the community, like the school system, the fire department, the police force, even in New York City with all of its many assets. During September 11th, the fire department became an inspiration for people. And a fire truck couldn't go down the streets without citizens applauding. It was something, it was a community phenomenon that made people feel stronger, protected, safer, and more capable of taking care of themselves through their community institutions. So I like the approach of community responses. That is a different level of abstraction, but it's getting at many of the same issues of dealing with overwhelming trauma, creating an interface that's manageable, and then processing the experience. I can't tell you whether dendritic knobs are involved or not, but it wouldn't surprise me a bit. Mike, any progress there? Dennis, do you want to try to read through my?
I can read it. I can read his slides for him. Mike, if you
offer a tour of them?
Is that Mike or is that Harold?
That's Harold.
I can read them.
Go for it.
Can you pull up the next slide, Mike? Well, you really, according to, and I've seen Mike's response to this before. It was the two of you guys put together. It was totally awesome. So I'm going to do my best to kind of act like Mike and read this. According to Dr. Cudler, there's a problematic conceptual bifurcation within American psychiatry, medicalizing versus personalizing, that affects the study of psychological trauma and causes underlying tension. This can be historically personified by comparing the psychoanalytic perspective of psychiatrist Henry Crystal, who concentrated on mental structures and process, with his son, who specializes in psychopharmacology, neuroimaging, molecular genetics, and computational neuroscience, who emphasizes brain structures and the neurophysiological processes. The latter of which is reminiscent of some early writings of Freud, who often that trauma arises when an overwhelming stressor burns out neurological connections. Young Crystal's work with ketamine suggests that it promotes neural plasticity, i.e. the restoration of neural circuits. But this model, which is used to explain the salutary effects of another physical treatment modality, transcranial magnetic stimulation, seems to also coincide with positive outcomes for some forms of talk therapy. Ergo, could we find new ways to talk to one another, i.e., could these observations serve as a bridge that spans between the medical and the personal, psychosocial perspectives for understanding and treating the traumatized? DSM-3 and the sea change in American psychiatry. We're comparing prior to 1980s and after 1980s. The earlier privileged soft interpersonal participant observer science. Case reports are evidence. The model values deep interpersonal studies that underscore differences between the patients. The data include the patient's subjective experience, which infers unconscious mental mentation. The patient, what he, she is, and treatment is person. And psychological events, including conflicts, determine meaning, i.e. the psyche. And then after 1980, privilege is hard empirical science. Case reports are only anecdotes. Evidence is numerical, drawn from aggregate data studies that highlight similarities among patients. Data are only observable or conscious reports. Patient is what he, she has, and treatment is objective. And psychological events are merely epiphenomena. As a relevant player in American psychiatry, psychodynamic theory is on life support. Cudler quoted, recent NIMH strategic plan further reduces mental disorders to more fundamental, primarily biological components, i.e. targets, hypothesized mechanisms of action and their ability to modify disease, behavior, or functional outcomes. The underlying assumption is that modification of the target will result in improvement. And Cudler also said, our immediate help is needed for developing a response to the draft PTSD clinical practice guidelines of the American Psychological Association on PTSD. If left as proposed, that guideline would not mention psychodynamic theory or practice at all. Database searches, article titles, February 2017. This is going to make me sad. Post-traumatic or PTSD, NIMH PubLed, 11,000. PEPR, Psychoanalytic Electronic Publishing, 34. Post-traumatic or PTSD plus combat, 632 in PubMed, and 1 on group treatment in PEP. Combat stress, there was 100 in PubMed and 2 book reviews in PEP. I said this is going to make me sad. War neurosis, there were 9 before 1980 and 10 between 1920 and 1944. So this is quoting Balson and Dempster, Treatment of War Neurosis from Vietnam, published in 1980. Army psychiatrists described the results from their evaluation of 15 combat veterans using hypnosis. Argued for a psychodynamic etiology of combat neurosis as a result of the interaction of a chance traumatic reality stress and an internal affectual experience. Symptom selection may serve to symbolically express a disordered self-perception. Believe they verified a theory of internal conflict and compromise formation as advocated by Erickson and by Brenner, at least among some casualties, in which a combat trauma causes a strong regressive response that is qualitatively specific for that soldier. Schwartz, Introduction and Overview of Psychoanalytic Approach to the War Neurosis. This was Psychotherapy of the Combat Veteran, 1984. Conducted analytic psychotherapy of Vietnam veterans, which permitted a deeper appreciation of the personal meaning of the veteran's combat experience. Especially studied patients' verbal associations, dreams, and transference reactions to him. Primary focus was on the role of unconscious guilt. And he argued for a common sense bifocal approach for understanding post-traumatic psychological disturbances. Regression, the inevitable response to massive stress, can in and of itself lead to altered mental functioning. The claim that all regression derives from predeployment predisposition is to misunderstand the organism as a physiological entity excuse me, whose primary motive is survival. On the other hand, to state that soldiers' emotional conflicts begin only at the moment of trauma, that they bring none of their past distortions to that event, is to be naive about psychological functioning. Stressful events can only be perceived through the veil of one's past. Gershon, 2010. Perspectives, The Untold War Inside the Hearts, Minds, and Souls of Our Soldiers by Nancy Sherman. Sherman enumerates a number of specific moral conflicts that commonly lead to significant suffering for soldiers. Moral injury. A feeling of taint when fighting a war driven by policy that is wrong or unjust. Guilt over causing collateral damage, especially the death of children. Guilt over manipulation of trust. One of her informants served as an interrogator in a fascinating elaboration of how interrogation can involve exploiting the detainee's basic need for human connection. Guilt for justified killings. Guilt over responsibility for accidental acts such as the deaths of fellow soldiers. And luck guilt, a variant of survivor guilt, soldiers who are assigned to positions of safety off the battlefield while their comrades serve and often die in combat experience. Guilt over weakness or failure to live up to military stoic ideals. Verhaeghe and Van Hoel, Actual Neurosis and PTSD, the Impact of the Other, Psychoanalytic Psychology from 2005. A large body of research indicates that trauma is necessary but insufficient condition for the development of PTSD. Whereas exposure to trauma is widespread, the majority of the Western population experiences a traumatic event during the course of life. Only a minority of those exposed are likely to develop a clinically significant psychopathology. The conditional probability of developing PTSD following any trauma appears to vary from approximately 1% to 9%, according to Paris, and 8% to 24%, according to Lee and Young. Consequently, we must conclude there is no direct connection between trauma and the development of PTSD. Yet another research finding also indicates that the importance of the trauma is relative. Against all expectations, no connection can be found between the objective severity of the traumatic event and the development of psychopathology. Thus, there must be mediating factors of vulnerability and resilience. It is the ever-complex interplay between nature and nurture that determines the final result. And he ends with a quote from Albert Einstein: "Sometimes the things that can't be counted don't count, and the things that count can't be counted." Thank you. So as I was telling Norman as we were getting ready for this, I kind of thought he was being the good postmodern respondent to Harold, and pointed out a whole different set of knowledge that really I think points to what Harold wanted people to point to. But it also raises the question for me in terms of the research that gets, we could say, what's wrong with you analysts for not sitting down and writing? Or we could say, of all these papers that have been published recently, how many of them were funded by a government grant? And if we take it from that direction, then we're really saying, has this become a part of the military-industrial complex that Dwight Eisenhower was so worried about? That when's the last time an analyst got a grant to write a paper? Been a while.
If you were to look at the slope of the curve of all those publications that Mike was plotting, you'd see that until the National Institutes of Mental Health created a study section on PTSD, nobody could get funded for PTSD research.
Wow.
That only happened in the late 1980s. The structure of our organizations, even the NIMH, they used to say, well, PTSD is an anxiety disorder, so research grants will be reviewed after all the other anxiety disorder grants get reviewed. And because in those days, people were more interested in panic disorder, you saw a lot of panic disorder things getting funded, and whatever money was left went to PTSD, which wasn't much.
Yeah.
Once we had somebody in the PTSD world who was also in the NIMH world, we were able to get her to advocate for a new study section, and suddenly the number of PTSD publications took off. And then it became a cottage industry where everybody wanted to get in on the act.
Yeah.
So yes, we tend to reify our own ideas at multiple levels.
I'm noticing the clock here. Do our participants have any questions for either Norman or for Mike or for Harold before we sign off here?
Well, while they're typing, I want to thank Mike for really a careful analysis of what I said in ways that open up things that I said that I maybe didn't see either. But particularly for focusing on the personal versus the empirically verifiable aspects of trauma.
Mhm.
You know, the one thing